The evening sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. A black sedan rolled smoothly down the road, its driver relaxed but alert. Inside, the man behind the wheel was just finishing up his workday, tired but content. He was a respected judge, known for his fairness and sharp mind in the courtroom. But here, in his own car, he was just another man heading home. A few blocks ahead, a police cruiser sat parked near a stop sign, its engine idling. The officer inside had been on duty for hours, his patience thinning with each routine traffic stop. He was known among his colleagues for being overzealous, quick to assume, quick to act. And today, he was looking for a reason to pull someone over. As the black sedan approached, the cop's eyes narrowed. The car wasn't speeding. It wasn't swerving. But the driver, something about him made the officer's instincts twitch. Maybe it was the way he sat, too calm, too confident. Or maybe it was just the color of his skin. The cop flicked on his lights. The sedan slowed and pulled over smoothly. The judge sighed, glancing at his mirror. He'd been through this before, too many times. But he knew the drill. Hands visible. Move slowly. Stay polite. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His posture was rigid, his voice tight. License and registration. The judge kept his tone calm as he reached for his glove compartment. Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped? The cop's jaw clenched. Just hand over the documents. The judge complied, passing his license through the window. The officer snatched it, his eyes scanning the details. Then, he froze. His face changed. The hard edge in his voice vanished. His fingers tightened around the license as if it had burned him. The name. The title. This wasn't just any driver. This was a judge. And not just any judge, one known for overseeing cases involving police misconduct. The officer's throat went dry. His mind raced. Did I just make the biggest mistake of my career? The judge watched him, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this shift before, the sudden change in tone, the nervous energy. But this time, he wasn't just a civilian. This time, he had power. And the cop knew it. The officer stood there, gripping the judge's license like it might disappear if he loosened his hold. His mind scrambled for the right words, but nothing came. The air between them grew heavier with each passing second. The judge waited. He had seen this reaction before, just never from the other side of a traffic stop. Finally, the cop cleared his throat. Your Honor, I didn't realize it was you. His voice was different now, less authority, more hesitation. The judge kept his hands on the wheel, calm but firm. Would that have changed anything? The question hung in the air. The officer shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how this looked. His body camera was on. His dashcam was recording. And the man in front of him knew the law better than he ever would. I just thought your taillight was out, the officer muttered, the excuse weak even to his own ears. The judge glanced at his rear lights, then back at the cop. Is that so? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The officer swallowed hard. He had pulled people over for less, much less. But now, under the quiet gaze of a man who spent his days holding people accountable, every justification he'd ever used felt flimsy. A car drove past, slowing slightly as the driver glanced at the scene. The cop's face burned. He wasn't used to feeling exposed like this. The judge studied him for a long moment. Then, in a tone that was neither angry nor forgiving, he said, "Officer, do you stop everyone with a broken taillight? Or just the ones who look like me?" The cop's mouth opened, then closed. He had no good answer. The judge reached for his registration, handing it over without hurry. "I'd like your badge number." And the name of your supervisor. The officer's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a warning. This wasn't going away. He had crossed a line, and now he was facing the one thing he'd never expected: consequences. For the first time in his career, he was the one who needed to be careful with his words. The officer's fingers twitched as he held the registration papers. His training had prepared him for violent suspects, for high-speed chases, for life-or-death decisions. But nothing had prepared him for this: standing in the fading daylight, being measured by the calm, unflinching gaze of a judge. My badge number? The cop repeated the words like they were foreign. His mind raced. If I give it, this goes on record. If I refuse, that would only make things worse. The judge didn't blink. Yes. And your supervisor's name? His voice was steady, the same tone he used in court when a witness was avoiding the truth. The cop's shoulders tightened. For years, he'd been the one asking questions, demanding answers. Now the roles were reversed, and the weight of it pressed down on him. He could already picture the internal investigation, the awkward explanations to his sergeant, the sideways looks from other cops in the precinct. It's, badge 1874, he finally muttered. Sergeant Reynolds is my supervisor. The judge nodded slowly, committing the information to memory. Thank you. A tense silence followed. The officer fumbled with his ticket pad, unsure what to do next. Part of him wanted to write a citation anyway, just to prove he hadn't been wrong. But another, quieter part knew that would only dig his hole deeper. The judge watched the internal struggle play out on the cop's face. He'd seen it before, not in traffic stops, but in his courtroom. The moment when someone realized their excuses wouldn't work anymore. Tell me something, officer, the judge said, his voice quieter now. If I weren't a judge, if I were just another man driving home, how would this have gone? The cop's pen froze above the paper. The question was a trap, and they both knew it. Any answer he gave would either condemn him or sound like a lie. Before he could reply, the judge continued. Would you have asked me to step out of the car? Run my name for warrants? Maybe search the vehicle? The officer's jaw clenched. He'd done all those things before, countless times. Always with a reason, at least in his own mind. But now, under the spotlight of that question, those reasons felt thin. A siren wailed in the distance, breaking the moment. The cop exhaled sharply and made a decision. He tore the half-written ticket off his pad and crumpled it in his fist. You can go, he said, avoiding the judge's eyes as he handed back the license and registration. The judge took the documents, but didn't start the car. Not yet. This isn't about me leaving, officer. It's about what happens next time, with someone who doesn't have a robe and a gavel. The words landed heavily. The cop opened his mouth, then closed it again. No clever comeback came. The judge finally turned the key in the ignition. As the engine hummed to life, he left the officer with one final thought. You have power. But it's not unlimited. Remember that. Then he pulled away, leaving the cop standing alone in the road, with nothing but his thoughts and the sinking realization that today might have changed everything. The judge drove away, his hands steady on the wheel but his mind racing. He'd been in similar situations before, too many times, but this was the first time his position had flipped the script so dramatically. The look on that officer's face would stay with him. Not anger. Not even shame. Just pure, cold realization, like a man watching his own hand get caught in a trap he'd set himself. As he turned onto the highway, his phone buzzed. His wife. He hesitated before answering. You're late, her voice came through, warm but concerned. Everything okay? Yeah, he said automatically. Then, after a beat, just got held up. He could have told her. She would have understood. But some things sat too heavy to put into words right away. Back on the quiet street, the cop stood frozen beside his cruiser. The judge's taillights had disappeared around the corner, but his words still rang in the officer's ears like an alarm. You have power. But it's not unlimited. His radio crackled to life. Unit 12, status check. He reached for it mechanically. Unit 12 clear, he muttered. No mention of the stop. No explanation for his delay. As he slid back into the driver's seat, his reflection in the rearview mirror caught him off guard. He looked smaller somehow. The confident set of his jaw had gone slack. His usual tough guy squint had softened into something uncertain. Then he noticed the dashcam's blinking red light. Every second of the encounter was recorded. His stomach dropped. If the judge decided to file a complaint, if Internal Affairs reviewed the footage. The cigarette he'd been craving suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth before he'd even lit it. Across the street, behind the curtains of a modest brick house, an elderly woman lowered her binoculars. Mabel Watkins had seen the whole thing from her living room window, the unnecessary stop, the tense exchange, the way the cop's demeanor had changed when he saw that license. Her gnarled fingers dialed a number she knew by heart. Pastor Johnson? It's Mabel. You know that community oversight meeting next week? I think I just saw exactly what y'all been talking about. The judge's house was quiet when he arrived, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. His wife took one look at his face as he walked through the door and immediately knew something was wrong. You sure you're okay? She asked, handing him a glass of water. He took a slow sip before answering. Got pulled over today. Her eyebrows shot up. Speeding? No. He set the glass down carefully. No reason at all. Until he saw my ID. The unspoken meaning hung between them. His wife's mouth tightened into a thin line, that familiar mix of anger and exhaustion. She'd heard these stories before, but never when it involved her husband's position. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. The judge ran a hand over his face. That was the question, wasn't it? He could file a complaint, make it official. But part of him wondered, would that really change anything? Or would it just be another case number in some overstuffed file cabinet? Meanwhile, the officer sat in his parked cruiser 3 blocks away, engine off, staring at his dashboard computer. His finger hovered over the delete button for the dashcam footage. One click and the evidence would be gone. His partner's voice crackled through the radio, you coming or what? We got that domestic disturbance call. Be right there, he responded automatically. But he didn't move. The delete option taunted him. It would be so easy. No footage, no proof. Just his word against some guys, even if that guy was a judge. But then he remembered the way the judge had looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. Like he'd expected better. With a sudden, sharp movement, he exited the menu without deleting anything. At the small Baptist church on Elm Street, Mabel Watkins sat in Pastor Johnson's office, her hands clutching her worn purse. I saw the whole thing, she told the pastor and 2 community leaders. That boy wasn't doing nothing wrong. Cop just decided he didn't like the look of him. Pastor Johnson exchanged glances with the others. This wasn't the first such report they'd heard, but it might be the most important. Mabel, he said carefully, you'd be willing to testify if this goes to court? The old woman drew herself up straight. In a heartbeat. I may be 78, but my eyes work just fine. Back at the precinct, the officer finally rejoined his partner. You look like hell, his partner remarked as they pulled out of the parking lot. What's eating you? The officer opened his mouth to brush it off like usual. But something stopped him. Think I might have screwed up today, he admitted quietly. His partner gave him a strange look. That wasn't something they usually admitted, not even to each other. The domestic disturbance call went normally. Too normally. Like nothing had changed. But as they drove through the neighborhood, the officer found himself noticing things he never had before: the way people on the sidewalk tensed when their cruiser passed, how mothers pulled their kids a little closer. Had they always done that? The judge sat in his home office late that night, the glow of his laptop illuminating tired eyes. On the screen was an official complaint form, just a few clicks away from being submitted to the Police Oversight Board. His finger hovered over the trackpad. Still up? His wife stood in the doorway, robe pulled tight against the night chill. "Can't sleep," he admitted. He turned the screen toward her, trying to decide if this will actually do any good. She studied the form, then his face. "You think they'll just brush it under the rug?" "Maybe." He sighed. "Or maybe it becomes one more log on a fire that eventually burns the whole system down." His wife sat beside him, placing her hand over his. "Since when did you start worrying about making waves?" That drew a small smile from him. She was right. The man who'd sentenced drug lords and corrupt politicians wasn't usually the type to second-guess himself. He clicked submit with sudden determination. At the precinct the next morning, Sergeant Reynolds squinted at his computer screen. The complaint had landed in his inbox before dawn. He rubbed his temples. This was exactly the headache he didn't need. 1874. My office. Now. His bellow carried through the bullpen. The officer entered warily, closing the door behind him. He didn't need to ask what this was about, the look on his sergeant's face said it all. "You stupid son of a," Reynolds caught himself, lowering his voice to a furious whisper. "You pulled over Judge Williams? And you didn't have probable cause? I thought his taillight." "Don't." Reynolds slammed a hand on the desk. "Just don't. I watched the dashcam footage. There was no damn taillight out." The officer had never seen his sergeant this angry. Not even when they'd had that drunk driving incident last year. Reynolds leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to review every use of force and stop report you filed in the last 6 months. And then you're going to explain to me, under oath if necessary, exactly how many of those were as flimsy as this one." The officer opened his mouth to protest, but Reynolds cut him off. "This isn't just about you anymore. That complaint goes up the chain, they'll be looking at all of us. Clean your house before IA does it for you." Across town, Pastor Johnson adjusted his tie as he entered the courthouse. He'd requested an emergency meeting with Judge Williams, using connections from their college days. The judge looked up from his desk when the pastor entered. "This is a surprise. I think you'll understand why I came," Pastor Johnson said, taking a seat. He slid a notarized statement across the desk, Mabel's eyewitness account. "You're not the only one who saw what happened." The judge read the statement carefully. When he looked up, there was something new in his eyes, not just determination, but something like hope. "The Community Oversight Committee wants to make this a test case," the pastor continued. "But we need to know, will you back us up?" Outside the window, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long beams across the judge's desk. "Let me make some calls," the judge said. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as rumors spread. Reporters had started calling, sniffing around about some big story involving one of their officers. The chief had called an emergency meeting, and everyone knew it was about the judge's complaint. The officer sat at his desk, pretending to review old case files while his coworkers shot him sideways glances. His partner slid into the adjacent chair. "So it's true?" his partner muttered under his breath. "You pissed off a judge?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. At the courthouse, Judge Williams stood before a packed press conference. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," he said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "It's about a pattern that needs to change." Behind him stood Pastor Johnson, Mabel, and 3 other community leaders. The elderly woman kept her back straight despite the uncomfortable shoes she'd worn for the occasion. A reporter shouted, "Your Honor, will you be pressing charges?" The judge paused just long enough to make everyone lean forward. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. The Police Oversight Board will be reviewing not just this incident, but the officer's entire record, as they should have been doing all along. Back at the station, all hell broke loose when the news broke. The chief stormed into the bullpen, face purple with rage. "Who leaked that footage?" he roared. No one answered, but several officers glanced toward Internal Affairs. The IA lieutenant simply shrugged. "Transparency works both ways, Chief." The officer in question sat frozen at his desk, watching his career unravel in real time on the precinct's TV. There he was on screen, clear as day, making the stop with no valid cause. The news ticker below screamed, "Judge's traffic stop sparks police accountability debate." His phone buzzed again, this time from his wife. That evening, the officer sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched beer in front of him. His wife's eyes were red-rimmed. "How many times?" she asked quietly. "What? How many times have you done this before?" Her voice cracked. "To people who couldn't fight back?" The question hung between them like a guillotine. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. The truth was, he'd lost count. On the living room TV, the news showed community members gathering outside the station, holding signs that read, "End racial profiling," and "Justice for all." Among them stood Mabel, gripping her sign with both hands, her silver hair shining under the streetlights. The police chief's office felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The officer sat stiffly across from the chief, his union rep, and the Internal Affairs captain. The dashcam footage played on a loop on the chief's monitor, his own face frozen in that moment of realization when he'd seen the judge's ID. "Effective immediately," the chief said, sliding a termination letter across the desk, "Your badge and gun." The union rep started to protest, but the officer surprised everyone by raising his hand. "It's fair." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollowed out but clear. "I would have written myself up if I'd seen that footage from the other side." The chief studied him for a long moment before nodding. "At least you've got the guts to admit it. That counts for something." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to nearly 200 people. Judge Williams watched from his chamber's window as Pastor Johnson led the group in prayer. Mabel stood front and center, her sign now reading, "My eyes have seen the truth." His clerk knocked gently. "The police commissioner is on line 1, Your Honor. Says it's urgent." The judge picked up the phone, expecting a fight. Instead, the commissioner's voice was measured. "We're implementing new bias training. Reviewing all stops from the past year. I'd like you to consult on the reforms." A long pause. "Why me?" the judge asked. "Because you saw the problem up close," the commissioner said. "And apparently, you're the only one who could make us see it too." 3 months later. The former officer sat in the community center audience, listening to Judge Williams outline the new police accountability measures. He'd come anonymously, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. Next to him, Mabel squinted at the pamphlet. "These small print letters are murder," she muttered, then glanced at him. "You look familiar." His breath caught. But before he could respond, she patted his hand. "Never mind. Just glad to see young folks taking an interest." On stage, the judge was saying, "Real change starts when we see each other as people first." The former officer stood quietly and slipped out. But for the first time in years, he walked through the neighborhood with his head up, ready to really see the people he'd sworn to protect, and to be seen in return.